Hey, how's it going? This is Russ, and this is video number 5 in a series of videos I'm putting together to show how I build Cigarbox ukuleles. In this video, we're going to cover how to build these two necks. Okay, there's a lot involved. I'm not going to get into too much of the intricate detail because of the number of steps. I want to try to keep this video brief and informative. So, that being said, let me show you how I did it. In the last video that I put on YouTube, I had predetermined for the Windsor box that it was going to be 6 1/4 inches from the bridge to the edge of the box with a 15-inch scale. So doing the math, that gives me an 8 3/4 inch fretted area plus another 6 inches for the headstock, resulting in a 14 3/4 inch overall neck blank. Add to that 2 pieces each at 6 inches for the headstock and another 1 piece each at 3 inches and 2 inches for the heel. I've got a really nice piece of flamed grain maple that I'm going to use for both necks. Check out the grain. That's a really nice looking piece of wood. Here I am ripping that piece of maple to the appropriate neck width on my table saw. Once again, using my awesome 25-cent garage sale square, I marked the pieces that needed to be cut to the right length, and here I am on my chop saw, cutting them to length. I like to use the chop saw instead of the table saw because the table saw sometimes has blade deflection, doesn't give me a truly square edge, which comes in handy having that square edge when it comes up to final assembly. So just cutting them all to length, and here's all the guys cut to length, ready to go for the next step. There's a decent piece of software out there called WFret that allows you to input the scale length of the number of frets you want to use. That's a great tool. It prints out a paper copy of where your fret markings go. Whenever I make a new neck scale length, I actually use that software and then I create a hard copy. So these are the templates that I use. I have a 15-inch template that'll work for this instrument. So what I did was find that and then clamp it down to the neck in the appropriate location, mark it with a pencil, and then come through with a little bit more accurate square to mark my fret locations. Always double check your work, make sure that everything's going according to plan, which is what I'm doing here, so it all looks good. What you're looking at here is a mini table saw. I built a housing around it to support the full length of the necks because it's hard to work off of that little tiny platform that is the saw. And also the saw blade was much too wide to use for cutting fret slots, so I had to replace that. I found a blade online, a slotted blade, that actually works really well. So that's what that is. And then in the next shot you can see I'm just cutting some fret slots here. Yeah, that's not slow motion. I actually went that slow. You want to make sure you go slow, take your time, be patient, because you want these fret slots to be true. You don't want to goober it up at this point. Here's what the necks look like after I've cut all the fret slots. You can see I also use that fret slot cutter to create the grooves that the fretboard inlay is going to go on for the Windsor box. At this point, the neck width is uniform. I leave it that way so that I can make sure that the fret slots are all square with the play action. And then we want to taper the neck so it's more narrow at the nut and wider where it meets the body. So I use a taper gauge or a taper fixture along with my table saw to cut that angle in. So this is a video just showing how I use that taper gauge. I'm not going to go into details on how to use that. There's plenty of information online. It'll show you how to do it. It's pretty easy. The Padron box is going to use round inlays in the fret area, so this just shows how I mark the location for those inlays. And I didn't capture on video drilling those pockets in, but there's a picture of both the necks ready for the inlay. This picture shows the round inlays, which are basically cutoffs from the violin tuners I've used on past instruments using the Depression era ideology. Save it if you can use it again, right? Plus they make good inlay. And then the straight inlay hardwood for the slots for the Windsor box. Had to use a sanding block there to make sure everything fit okay. And then here it is after everything's been put in place and glued into position. Okay, so what I'm doing now is I'm sanding the inlays flush to the fret area. If you haven't noticed by now, I I don't use a fingerboard or a separate fretboard. I sink them right into the neck like on a Fender guitar. That's what it looks like when it's all been sanded flush. And I also fine sand. This is where I deviate from other builders. I actually finish sand this right now because once I put those frets in, I don't have to go back in there with sandpaper and mess up the frets. Now it's time to put the fret wire in place. I do purchase the fret wire. That's not something that I make on my own, of course. And this old behemoth right here is a big cast iron drill press from yesteryear. I was planning on restoring it, never got around to it, and then found that it makes a really good fret press. And as you can see, I don't use a fret board. I actually sink the frets right into the neck like on a Fender guitar. So there's a picture of me lining that up and then pressing the frets. And I use a couple pieces of hardwood stock that I've been using for a long time. So over the years, they're kind of like naturally been grooved to fit the fret wire nicely. So I'll press that in and then I'll rough cut it. It's going to be, there's going to be fret wire extending out the sides of the neck. So what you'll see after I show a picture of the frets all pressed in is that they're very rough right there. So I'll take them to my belt sander and I'll actually use the belt sander to sand those frets flush to the side of the instrument, and then also put the beveled edge on the frets so that it's playable and there's no rough edges. So what you see here is gluing the back end of the headstock. It's glued and clamped, and you can see that I've covered the fret area with painter's tape just to protect it for the next few steps. And then because of the tape, there's a little bit of overhang. So back to the bandsaw to trim that flush, and I'll actually take that back to my sander too to make sure everything's nice and clean and flush there before the next step. So what you see here is I've marked out the right thickness for the headstock and also the angle that I want to put on it, and it varies depending on what kind of tuners you want to use. So that's what you see there, and then there it is after I've cut it and cleaned it up, ready to start putting sides on the headstock. This picture shows the headstock sides being glued in place, and then I sketched out the pattern for the heads and then cut them out of my bandsaw. So that's what it looks like at this point. So the next step was to take them back to the belt sander and smooth the tops and the bottoms of the headstock off, which I did. And then this is one of my favorite tools. I like this reciprocating drum sander. I use this to shape the sides of the neck so that they matched the patterns a little bit better. And this is what they look like afterwards. At this point, I started noticing the one on the right looks a lot like a canoe paddle. I wasn't happy with that, so I addressed that later. So you can see here that I'm using a piece of marble, which is very flat, to use as a guide when I assemble the heel of the instrument. And I do that because it makes it easy. That's why I use the chop saw in the first place, to make sure that I don't have to like tweak or refinish where the heel meets the box. So there it is, being assembled on the marble, and then there's a picture of everything clamped together. Next, I marked out the profile of the heel where it meets the box. So that's what you see in this photo, and then there's a picture of after I ran it through the bandsaw. So I decided I didn't like that canoe paddle look, so I just decided to taper the sides of that padron head a little bit, and there's a picture of it after I got done cutting and cleaning that up. Okay, this next step is just basically shaping and contouring the neck. I'm using my belt sander as just like a shaping tool. It's all kind of freehand, but you want to take that sharp corner off of that neck and then shape it so that it fits nicely in the palm of your hand. In this step, I'm just planning out the tuner spacing. So that just shows both the ways I plan that out. And then once I get that determined, I go ahead and just pre-mark the drill holes with a punch. So the next step is to drill the holes for the tuners. I highly recommend you use a drill press for this, not a hand drill, because you really want to have those perpendicular to your headstock. Otherwise, they end up looking all crooked and sloppy. So just using my drill press there to put those holes in place. So this shows the patron head after I've got the tuner holes drilled in place. And then there's a ferrule that goes on the top of that. So I use these tapered reamers to kind of create that tapered pocket for that ferrule. And then there's a picture of them in place after I put those holes in position. They're not permanently affixed there. They're just there right now to make sure they fit. For the violin tuners, it's a little bit different. You have to use a special tool. It's a taper tool. It's designed to match the taper on a violin peg. So the previous picture showed the tuners and this is the reamer. So it's very sharp. And then, of course, just breaking open the pack of violin tuners there. So you want to go in there with that reamer and just gradually take your time, go slow. It gets quick once you start getting towards the thick end of that reamer, so you have to be really careful not to overdo that hole. But you use it just like you would use any kind of a tap or a die, just kind of like work it in and then back it out, work it in and back it out a little bit more to create those holes. All right, the next step is to seat the nuts. I use hardwood, really hard wood. It seems to work well for me. So what I do is I mark that, and then I take a mini miter saw to make sure that I'm cutting that nut groove nice and even so that it all fit well together. So this is just a video showing me cutting that. And then I use a precision screwdriver as a sort of like a chisel to knock that out. And of course, I take a file in there and clean it up, and then glue, seat, and clamp the nut so that it's in position. And the final step, probably one of the more tedious steps, but definitely worth it. And this is where some of the craftsmanship and artsmanship comes in, is just to sand it. And a lot of hand sanding, 80 grit, 120 grit, and then ultimately 220 and 330 grit. So just doing some final touches on cleaning it up, making it look pretty. A lot of hand sanding. This is the final slide, shows the necks completed. The nuts, of course, are kind of high right now, but I leave them that way so that I can sand them down once I get everything assembled and tweak the instrument for the right action over the frets. So that's the last slide. Hopefully that was informative for everyone. I do plan on making another video where I bring it all together, do some inside bracing, and build the string retainer and the bridge. So you can look forward to that in the next video. Ta-ta for now.